Hello, everyone, and welcome to this interview with myself, Matt from Labour Outlook and Arise Festival, and our good friend Rebecca Long Bailey, MP. As some viewers and readers would have seen, this week saw the King's Speech from Rishi Sunak, where the government sets out its legislation for the next period, and this will be debated in Parliament for a couple of weeks. So we're delighted to have Becky with us today to quickly discuss what was in and maybe also what wasn't in the King's Speech. Welcome, Becky.
Hi.
So first of all, what do you think about what was announced by Rishi Sunak in the King's Speech yesterday?
Well, there wasn't much announced at all. It was more notable for what was not in it rather than what was in it. But I think perhaps the most concerning thing that was mentioned for me was the offshore petroleum licensing bill. Now, this completely undermines the government's so-called commitment to net zero. And then at the end of the speech, he mentioned that at the beginning of his speech. And then at the end of the speech, there was a throwaway comment about leading on tackling climate change. So it didn't make any sense at all. And I think what's even more staggering is that this announcement came hot on the heels of yet more reports about rampant profiteering in the energy sector. Only recently, Shell reported eye-watering profits of about $6.2 billion between July and September, which was up sharply on the previous quarter. Now, what we should have seen instead of this bill announcement was an end to profiteering in the energy sector with tough price regulation, an end to private sector and overseas control of our critical energy assets, promotion of public ownership so that we can control our energy and develop the infrastructure that we need for a green transition in the future. And then later in the day, obviously, Rishi Sunak did a little bit of a speech and tried to argue that this offshore oil and petroleum licensing bill was going to give us energy security. And that makes no sense at all. The government's own North Sea Transition Authority estimated that 70% of the reserves actually in the North Sea are oil and not gas anyway. And the oil, it's majorly going to be exported around the world. 80%, I think, is the figure that's currently exported around the world. So any oil and gas that is got from the North Sea will be sold on global markets to the highest bidder. It won't be special mates rates for the UK so that we can bring energy bills down. And even the energy minister said that when she was on the television yesterday, that it's not going to bring people's bills down. So in terms of how it's going to benefit people in my constituency, well, firstly, it's not going to bring the bills down. And secondly, it's going to hamper our fight against climate change, which we should be ramping up significantly at the moment.
That's a good point for my link into my question about what wasn't in it, actually, because we saw earlier this week a figure from the UN criticising the poverty levels and child poverty levels in Britain and a lack of action around it. And you just mentioned about people's fuel bills, but it felt to me like one of the main things missing from the King's Speech, because we are in this, obviously the news for rightfully is dominated by what's the tragic events in Gaza, but we are still in the middle of a cost of living emergency that hasn't really changed. And yet there didn't seem to be any measures to tackle any additional measures at all on cost of living and poverty.
No, I mean, critics were calling it the all mouth and no trousers speech. It had the most words in a monarch speech since 2005, apparently, but the fewest bills in a monarch 2014. And you're right, I mean, people in my constituency in Salford, they'll look at it and wonder what's actually in it to make their quality of life better, to help them with the cost of living, to support public services, to improve public transport. And the answer is nothing. There was nothing in that speech at all that would have improved quality of life for people in my constituency. And there are so many parts that were missing from the speech itself. The mental health bill was abandoned yet again, despite this being a manifesto promise in 2017 and 2019. And we're in a mental health crisis at the moment, as you know. There was no conversion therapy ban, despite this being repeatedly promised by government. The government also talked about the implementation of minimum service levels. And this was a reference, obviously, to public sector workers striking for fair pay and funding. But the absurdity of this is that, firstly, minimum service levels already exist in many of the key life and death sectors before workers go on strike. But the irony of it is that the government can't even deliver minimum services on a day-to-day basis when there aren't strikes taking place because of chronic underfunding and underpay. So it was just an absurd statement for the Prime Minister to make. But on the cost of living, that's the most worrying omission from the speech, really. Now, the OECD has already said this year that the UK's forecast to have the highest inflation of any major economy. And that means people are really going to struggle, particularly in the winter. But there was nothing from the Prime Minister at all. And I don't think there were any plans to do anything anytime soon, because this is a government, remember, that gave tax breaks to banks at the last financial statement, whilst expecting everybody else to just suck up the damage that was caused by Liz Truss's disastrous mini budget. And as incomes continue to get squeezed, that means spending in our constituencies falls, the cost of living crisis lasts longer, and then businesses are hit and people start to lose their jobs. So we need immediate government intervention. And there's a number of things that they should have done. They should have put in place a plan to tackle in-work poverty. They should have looked at rent support and rent controls, as rent is quite often outstripping income. They should have been settling public sector pay disputes. They should have been setting out how they're going to provide energy bill support over the winter through taxing the big oil and gas giants more robustly. And they also, in my view, needed to be looking at rocketing food prices. Other countries across the world are already putting in place measures to put caps on food prices, in particular on particular goods, so that people can afford to get the basics that they need to survive. That's what we should be doing here in the UK, but we're not even talking about it. And then beyond that, of course, the Prime Minister had there was a lot of guff about how he was going to grow the economy, but there was no detail in the speech to actually prove that that was going to happen. And for that to happen, you've got to invest in the tools that increase productivity. That means investing in public services, skills, infrastructure, research and development, and industry through Green New Deals and big sector proposals. And it means supporting the industries that are struggling here in the UK, such as our steel industry, which is hugely profitable, but needs public sector support. And the government's just turning a blind eye. And then the last thing, of course, that the government should have been doing was looking at how it was going to fund our public services properly to achieve this growing economy. And that means they should have been taxing fairly. That meant higher windfall taxes on oil and gas profits. And it also means looking at a tax on income from wealth so that we can properly fund public services.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think we on the left need to be clear that we keep raising a sort of radical economic agenda, because the situation is deepening. Yeah, it feels like sometimes the demands, because the situation is so bad, the demands, you can get into a thing where you're sort of chasing after them a bit and not proposing the radical measures that you're talking about, like price controls, rent controls, public ownership, that actually are now what's needed to address the crisis because it's so deep. And my final question is touching on something that wasn't in the speech, but relates to the issue of housing, which you mentioned, which I just wondered if you could give a few words on how you see this sort of bid from the Home Secretary. And it wasn't included in the speech, but there was a lot of press around it before and after, talking about removing tents from homeless people. It's something that a lot of people, I think, will be seeing in their communities. I certainly see here in where I live in North London, and also when I visit my family in Peterborough, it's like this massive homelessness crisis. There's no other way to put it. You see it everywhere in town centres, and yet we have the Home Secretary seemingly lobbying the Prime Minister to basically argue that people are just a lifestyle choice or something like that.
I know, they were absolutely appalling comments to make. Being homeless is not a lifestyle choice, it's a crisis situation. And there are so many reasons as to why somebody presents as homeless. It could be issues in relation to mental health. It could be the fact that they don't have a sufficient income to rent a property or buy a property. It could be relationship issues that they've had with family members or loved ones. And that person requires support. And to provide that support, we need properly funded public services to provide those arms to hug that person and find out what we can actually do to get them back on their feet. And then the second thing that the government should have been doing was ramping up house building. We're in the middle of a housing crisis. It's not just the issue about rents spiraling out of control and mortgages, going through the roof, which they are at the moment. There's actually not enough supply, both in terms of private housing, but more importantly, social housing. We need to see a huge house building programme to make sure that we can meet demand. I mean, in Salford alone, I think at the last count, we had about 6,000 people on the housing waiting list trying to be housed. And that's just one city. in the UK. So you can imagine the scale of the problem. So to address it, we have to see more homes being built.
Thank you, Becky. I think we'll leave it there. Really good to speak to you, although about quite depressing matters at times. Thanks again for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.